Thank you. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. What do I do? So I run a research center at Harvard. There are 3 parts to our research center. There is teaching. We have classes, about 500 graduate students take our classes on an annual basis. We produce serious academic research, usually pretty quantitative, and then we propose ways of putting that research into practice. The idea is that research must have a life outside the university. And so that's what we do. And what is the one skill I think is essential in that? Well, I think technical literacy is quite important. I started my life as a computer programmer, and that kind of range of experience and skills has served me well. Almost every job of any significance these days requires a high degree of technical literacy to make good decisions. It's the nature of leadership in the digital age. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to start my speech today talking about the year I think things really changed, which would be 1984. And many of you with a firm memory of 1984 will recall that was the year that Steve Jobs introduced the first Macintosh personal computer. That's actually not what I'm talking about. In 1984, a guy named Chuck Hull invented something called stereolithography. Today, we call stereolithography 3D printing. That's a 3D printer. It takes a spool of plastic thread and melts it down and sprays it into shapes. I have one. I bought one almost 7 years ago now. I have 3 children. My children are 9, 7, and 3. That means they grow out of their shoes very quickly. And so for about half the year, I print them sandals because it's cheaper than buying them shoes constantly. And not only that, but my boys love Legos, and so I print them Legos. And my daughter really wanted a dinosaur, so I printed a dinosaur. My children are growing up in a world where when they want a toy, Daddy prints it, which is kind of awesome, right? But about the time I got my 3D printer, a guy in Texas published the blueprints to print a fully functional handgun online, right? Meaning that anyone with a 3D printer in their home can actually print a gun. Just go to the hardware store to get some deck screws for ammunition. And so I think this story kind of perfectly captures the way our technology is outstripping the ability of our institutions to deal with it, right? Our institutions aren't really prepared for the pace and intensity of our technology. And the argument I'm going to make to you today is that this technology, a principal part of it is that it pushes power out of institutions. The traditional institutions that built the 20th century and the way they understand and use power, our technology pushes that power out of institutions, pushes it to individuals and to algorithms. And those, which you could argue the same thing, but for the purpose of this speech, we're going to say are different. And that's a profound change to the nature of power, and I think actually threatens the institutions of democracy that made the 20th century what it is. Across the board, whether we're talking about the military and the role of terrorism, or we're talking about manufacturing and the future of on-demand production, technology is pushing power out of all the big institutions. Like, I think about how I have a funny bump on my arm and I Google it instead of calling the doctor, right? That's just a simple example of the way the way we used to rely on certain kinds of expertise, instead of calling the doctor, now we're going elsewhere. And that has profound consequences when we think about it in terms of information, media, and democracy. And for many years as a computer programmer, I would sit in the back of the room at meetings where important people talked about important things and made important decisions. And I always would say, I'd listen to them talk in corporate boardrooms or in Democratic Party meetings or in Harvard faculty meetings, and I would think, I just don't think I live in the same world that they do. I feel like I'm living almost completely in a different world. And I thought maybe I just didn't understand enough, or my ignorance. And then I was reading, I love history, I read this book about World War I and the Guns of August. And the first 5 pages describe the funeral of King Edward VII in 1910. And when King Edward VII died, Barbara Tuchman says his funeral was the most opulent event in human history. Every nation of the world sent the most impressive display of military might and of wealth that they could muster. And if you had attended that funeral in 1910, you would have thought the monarchy would persist forever. And in fact, in the few months afterwards, the new King of England, King George, wrote letters to his best friends and first cousins, the Tsar of Russia and the Kaiser of Germany, and said, just imagine in 2018 when our grandchildren will be monarchs of Europe and the colonies. And as we know, very shortly, it was totally fragile. The monarchy was resting on a whole set of assumptions about institutions that had rotted out. And I think we're living in a similar moment for democracy, where our democracy, the institutions, the assumptions we have, they're very fragile, and it's a very dangerous place to be. And so to talk about this, I thought one of the best things to do is talk about computers. If I was giving this speech 35 years ago and I had asked you to describe a computer, you'd describe something like this. That's a Cray supercomputer circa 1974. It probably would have filled this stage here, right? And its base price was about $10 million without memory. Memory was extra. And this was a very impressive machine, but it was only available to the world's biggest institutions, to the biggest universities, to the biggest corporations, to the biggest governments. And if I was a nerd in high school. I desperately loved playing with computers. It's all I wanted to do. And if you were a nerd like that, in the 60s in the United States, your only choice, the only way you'd ever get any proximity to a computer was to go to a university. But what was happening on American university campuses in the 60s, in the early 70s? The anti-war movement, the civil rights movement. And so you have a generation of computer scientists. The first time you could major in computer science at American university was at Purdue University in 1962. And so you have a generation of computer scientists who graduate from school with a degree in computer science and having been on campuses in the midst of this huge amount of protest. And who is hiring computer scientists in the late 60s, early 70s? Who? The Pentagon. And how many of those students do you think want to go work at the Pentagon? Very few of them. Ted Nelson in 1973 wrote this book, Computer Liberation. You can and must understand computers. Ted Nelson invented something you use every day. He invented the hyperlink. If you click on a link, that was Ted's idea. And Ted said in this computer, you cannot trust the people in charge with computers because they are too powerful and they will use them to send you to wars that are not just. We have to claim the computer away from the people in charge, take the computer away from the man, and we have to do something radical. We have to build a personal computer. And there's a line in this book, in the future, hundreds of people will have their own computers and thousands will want them, right? Because it was unthinkable. This giant machine that cost 10 million bucks, that you would have one in your home, that was crazy. And this book was part of a whole culture. If you've read the Steve Jobs biography by Walter Isaacson, it talks about Ted Nelson and the culture and how this book helped him launch the idea of a personal computer. Bill Gates, with his first fortune, bought the rights to this book and republished it with Microsoft Press in 1984. This book was emblematic and a leader in the thinking of a whole generation of nerds who built the modern era. And that's how we go from computers that fill a room in the 70s to within 15 years, computers on our desktop. And then we start to plug these computers into each other to share printers and the old school H drive. And then we plug all the computers into all the other computers and we have the internet. And now we walk around with these incredibly powerful devices on our person. My iPhone is so much more powerful than a Cray supercomputer that you almost can't compare them. You know, a bicycle and a jet airplane are both modes of transportation. And in this way, too, the Cray supercomputer and my iPhone are both computers. right? That's about as close as I think we can get. And if I were to say to you that 35 years from now, you'll be able to walk into any store anywhere in the world, and for 200 euros and a low monthly metered fee, buy a Boeing 747 powered by a nuclear reactor, you would think I was nuts, but that's effectively what has happened with computing power, and that has profound consequences for our institutions. One of the most profound is that this technology is fundamentally about the individual, right? If you look at the top 1,000 accounts on Twitter, you find individuals. You don't find brands or institutions. And that's an important, institutions do not fare well in this technology. And that leads me very directly to one of the most important institutions we've got, which is the news media. In the traditional way we think about the news media, you have the news media establishment and the political establishment, both parties in the United States. They argue and they fight, and they basically come to a narrative about our politics that is then communicated to the public. That was the traditional way of thinking about it and talking about it. The candidates or the parties say, this is what's happening in America. And the news media says, well, that doesn't seem quite right. What about this and this and this? And they go back and forth, but they basically craft a narrative that's delivered to the public, right, about what's happening in the country. But when technology showed up, it really kind of changed that equation significantly. And I'm just going to briefly talk you through some key moments in American history to talk about it. So first, in November of 1963, John F. Kennedy, president of the United States, was shot and killed. Most Americans learned about it from television or radio. And pretty much every American who was alive remembered Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite was like every night he was on TV talking to you. He was a serious person. He was kind of like your serious uncle. And he took off his glasses and he cried on television. And this was a shock to Americans. And it was how many people experienced the death of John F. Kennedy. And then a little more than a decade later, reporters at the Washington Post, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, did an investigation that led to the resignation of the president. Two journalists, over a series of months, pursued this investigation against all odds to hold power accountable. And then with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the way most Americans experienced that was watching CNN. That experience took CNN from a kind of something of a joke or curiosity to a mainstream part of American news diets. And then the events of September 11th, the terrorist attack, almost every television station in the United States stopped twice a day for about 10 days to carry Rudy Giuliani's press conferences live. You couldn't really watch anything else when Mayor Giuliani gave one of these press conferences. Here were four crucial events in American history, all of them mediated and experienced by the American public through the press. Through television, through newspapers, but through the press. And now, let's talk about how most Americans found out that Osama bin Laden had been killed. The way most Americans found out Osama bin Laden had been killed was from Twitter or Facebook. Specifically from this guy, Keith Urban. Keith had been Donald Rumsfeld's chief of staff. But of course, by this time, it's the Obama administration, and Keith is a Republican, so he's a Republican consultant. He's a speechwriter for hire. But he tweets, I'm told by a reputable person they've killed Osama bin Laden. Hot damn. He had about 400 followers on Twitter. Within 2 hours, this tweet had gone viral and reached somewhere north of 20 million people. In the past, someone like Keith would have called a reporter and been a source. But in this case, he went directly to the American people. And I think even he was shocked. And then I also have to mention Osama bin Laden's next door neighbor accidentally live tweeted the whole raid, He said, hey, there's a helicopter landing on my neighbor's roof at 1 a.m. That's very unusual. And he had a whole series of tweets, right? Just to give you an idea. And so, whereas it used to be that the news media establishment and the political establishment had this kind of conversation, argument, and crafted a narrative for the American people, well, now we have a third entity in it. I would call it the netroots. It's not really the whole public. It's anyone who wants to insert themselves into that conversation. And most of the public don't want to insert themselves into that conversation. But a subset of people do, and they insert themselves in that conversation, and then they're able to shape the narrative. They're a part of the conversation that used to be just an elite conversation between the media and the political, the media elite and the political elite. And now there is a third group who are self-selected, appointed citizens who engage in that conversation to craft that narrative. And that is a principal way that we're able to, that's a principal way misinformation gets introduced into the political ecosystem. This is a visualization of the internet. If you were to map the internet, it looks something like this. This is a project out of MIT. It is diffuse. One of those dots is my mother's blog with photos of her grandchildren, and one of those dots is CNN, right? There isn't, the rules for power and authority are very different. They still exist, but they're very different than in the traditional world. And this has real consequences. And one of the consequences this has had that's been pretty dramatic is the impact this has had on the business of the media. In the United States, unlike Europe, we do not have a strong tradition of publicly funded news. There is national public radio and public broadcasting, but you know, depending on the region, somewhere less than 10% of its funding comes from the government. It's overwhelmingly funded by private donations. Almost all of the news in the United States comes from commercial media, commercial news organizations, and that is overwhelmingly newspapers. Newspapers provide the vast majority of the news in the United States. But something has happened to newspapers quite dramatic. This is a graph of revenue in the newspaper industry. You can see that about 2000, at its height, it had about $65 billion in revenue, and in about 17 years, last year, I think $12 billion was the revenue in the industry, right? So we're talking about a $48 billion collapse in about 15 years. That is roughly the same collapse the US steel industry experienced over about a 35-year time frame. I used to work at the Los Angeles Times on the business side. On a full-page ad in the Los Angeles Times, today is a Saturday, a full-page ad in the LA Times would cost about $40,000 to reach 400,000 readers. To reach the same 400,000 readers with a digital buy would be about $5,600, and to reach the same 400,000 readers with a Google search ad buy is about $16. And that, in a nutshell, it's kind of brutal, but that's effectively what has happened to the news industry in the United States. And this means that the number of firms, newspaper companies in the United States has collapsed, but of course some of that is mergers and acquisitions. So actually that blue line collapsing, that is the number of full-time employed reporters in the United States employed by newspapers. So you can see we go from about 410,000 to today we're at somewhere around 120,000 full-time employed reporters in the United States. That's over about a 15-year period. And so what does that mean? Well, in the United States we have 50 states. 21 of those states used to send a local reporter to Washington, D.C., and no longer do. That's 42 U.S. senators who never get a question from their hometown news. That's also 21 U.S. states who have no news about how what happens in Washington affects them. How does Obama's health care plan affect our local hospital? We don't know because there is no news. And not only that, but this is a graph of news deserts. The darker red, the more news there is. But effectively what this graph shows is that if you live outside the 10 largest cities in America, there's really no news. No news. And so In my view, we used to have a huge amount of news in the United States provided by newspapers and commercial entities. The business model has been dramatically impacted, and so we're left with a giant void in the public sphere. And what happens is something is going to fill that void. And it's what our president calls fake news, but I prefer to call mis and disinformation. Or sometimes my colleague at Harvard, Tom Patterson, calls it information pollution, right? Because it's not all false, which I'll get into in a moment. We have a project called the Information Disorder Lab, the ID Lab, where we try and understand the scope and nature of misinformation and disinformation. We have a taxonomy with 7 kind of major kinds of misinformation. The first is satire or parody, people doing things because they're funny that sometimes get taken seriously, which is not the intention. Misleading content is the use of information to frame something in a misleading way. It's technically true, but maybe they've omitted a couple of key details in order to frame it in some way. Impostor content, we have seen this a lot in Africa and Asia, where a story says it's a BBC story, and it's not a BBC story. We're beginning to see this more in the United States, imposter content, but we haven't seen a huge volume of it yet. Fabricated content is totally, completely, 100% made up. Moving down the second row, false connection. Sometimes we call that clickbait. That's when the headline says one thing and the body says another, right? And so the headline is really misleading about what's actually happening. False context. This is when something is true but shared with false context. So this happens frequently, for example, with hurricanes or bad weather. It'll say there'll be a photo of a flooded street and says this street is closed because of flooding. Well, the photo is true. It's from 6 years ago, but it's not flooded in this today, right? So that's an example of false context where it's true but given a different context. And then finally, manipulated content where photos, videos, PDFs are manipulated. They start with something true and they change it to make it false and to give it a certain kind of meme. And I'll just note that misinformation and disinformation that we're tracking is overwhelmingly visual for the most part, which is an important kind of distinction. And then we try and distinguish with 3 different kinds of information disorder. On the far left is misinformation. This is false, completely false, but not intended for harm necessarily. This is more accidental or parody or what have you. Its intent is not to harm. On the far other end, we have things that are malinformation. The purpose is to cause harm, and it could be true. An example is, we have pretty good evidence at this point that Russian security services hacked Hillary Clinton's campaign emails, provided those campaign emails to WikiLeaks. That is true. Those emails were true, but the purpose was to harm, right? And then in between, disinformation is both false and intended to harm. And so those are some distinctions we make in studying this in the taxonomy of it. But a crucial question, I think, is how widespread is misinformation and disinformation. And the honest answer is we don't really know because Facebook and YouTube won't tell us. That's the honest answer. But we have some guesses, right? Pew did a study that said somewhere north of 85% of Americans said they'd been confused or misled by something they read online. But the more shocking piece is almost 1 in 4 Americans shared something on social media even though they knew it was false. Okay? They knew it was false and they shared it anyway. Craig Silverman of BuzzFeed did his own investigation, found of the 20 most frequently shared articles on Facebook prior to the election, half were completely fabricated. One famous example is that the Pope endorsed Donald Trump, totally false. But it used to be that the old normal, I say, is that we had this, you'd have a political message or you'd have a piece of news or something, and you would take it to the media, and the media would evaluate it and deliver it to the public. But now then what happened was the internet came along and you could kind of go directly to the public. But then the volume of information got to such an extreme that the platforms that control the internet introduced algorithms to try and help make that a quote-unquote more efficient process, right? One of my favorite examples is if we all, everyone in this room, if we all took out our phones and we Googled the word Jaguar, right? Jaguar, some of us would get the car company, some of us would get a nature documentary about the panther, and some of us would get a sports team, right? Because there's so much information that algorithms are trying to understand, help us navigate it, because without these algorithms, there's too much to navigate. But it turns out that in many ways, those algorithms incentivize our worst behavior, at least the way they're currently designed. And the reality is we live in a political environment where your message gets pushed through the media, through algorithms, and you can also go directly. And in many ways, this slide is the one that I think best explains President Trump. He kind of brilliantly understands how to manipulate the media, understands how to game these algorithms. I'm not saying he actually, understands the detail of them, but he has an instinct for what will spread. And he's also able to go directly to his public, not the public, through Twitter, etc. But in many ways, we know a lot about mis and disinformation because, Barack Obama, about 12 years ago, an email started to circulate that said Barack Obama was a Muslim born in Africa. Right? Totally false. The Washington Post estimates 100 million Americans read that email. And I always think of that email as the email that launched 1,000 research projects. And so there are many PhD theses and many even research centers at universities like my own that are dedicated to understanding this question, because it's been a question actually for most of history. One of my favorite stories is the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, right? That John Adams, supporters of John Adams hired people to print pamphlets saying Thomas Jefferson had died. And then Thomas Jefferson had to hire people to ride through town saying, he's not dead, he's not dead. So misinformation has been a long-standing part of our political discourse, but the technology makes it much more dramatic. The technology threatens to drown out any truth. The technology makes it so that almost anyone can intervene with almost zero cost. But given all the research that's been done the last dozen years, we have definitely learned a few things, right? So the first thing we know is that rumors are sticky. The brain loves rumors. And generally speaking, the crazier the rumor, the better, right? The brain loves rumors. And the second thing we know, I think, is that corrections backfire. If I say to you, Obama is a Muslim is false, well, you end up remembering Obama is a Muslim, right? That's what you end up remembering. And the final thing we know is that source credibility is paramount. The people you trust, when they tell you things, you believe them. And so where the source really matters in a significant way. Now, let's think about this. Okay, so rumors are sticky. Well, then we have to find ways of making the truth louder. In many ways, I think this is the accountability we must demand of the digital platforms that control the public sphere these days, right? We must find ways to make the truth louder. This is pretty tricky with the collapse of the business model of news in the United States, because there's simply less truth out there. But that's an important thing. Corrections backfire. Well, we have to find alternative ways of telling stories. Instead of saying Obama is the Muslim is false, well, maybe we need photos of Obama's baptism, right? Look at these photos of Obama being baptized in a Christian church. And one of the challenges here is that the culture of the American news media, what they're even taught in journalism schools, is about a kind of accountability journalism that is about correction, right? Not about alternative narrative. And so part of this is teaching an entire profession to do their job differently. And then in terms of source credibility, well, this is easily the toughest one. In many ways, the lie that Obama is a Muslim born outside the United States was at least tacitly endorsed by most of the leadership of the Republican Party, and for many years. Like, it wasn't challenged. And one high-profile example is when John McCain was running against Barack Obama in 2008 and was asked about this, he would repeatedly tell audiences, that's a lie, don't believe it. And in many ways, that was one of the most important parts of trying to put that rumor to rest. Of course, he was pretty much alone among the leadership of the Republican Party in doing that. And in many ways, it was that culture, that permissive culture of the Republican Party, that allowed one of the chief perpetrators of that lie, Donald Trump, to take over the Republican Party today. So involving tribal leaders is easily the most difficult solution I think we're facing here. But at the end of the day, that's not enough, right? We have the collapse of local news is still a major issue. The digital platforms that control the space are opaque. We don't know what happens inside them. We don't know how much fake news there is because the platforms won't tell us. We don't really understand the dynamics of the space at all because there is so little information about it. And I would just add this on that front, that the algorithms are designed to privilege trust. It turns out that there are lots of compelling and relatively straightforward ways of measuring trust. But of course, measuring truth is much harder, arguably near impossible, but we've developed institutions like the institution of journalism to do it. And then my closing comment is that there were, eight companies that effectively control the public sphere in the United States: Amazon, Apple, eBay, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Snapchat, and Twitter. And these companies really operate almost without any accountability of any kind. And I think it's very clear at this point that it's very damaging to the democracy. And the question is, what kind of action might be taken? And I have many ideas, but that's not the subject of this talk. Thank you.